Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is in person at the International Environment House, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of the event. We have the pleasure to welcome you for the launch of a new report, Sand and Sustainability, 10 Strategic Recommendations to Avert a Crisis, prepared by a team of 22 authors led by Pascal Peduzzi, the director of the United Nations Environment Programme GRID-Geneva Center. Pascal will have the pleasure to chair and moderate this event and introduce the speakers when giving them the floor. Before I hand over to you, to Pascal, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event, and of course the link to the report, are being made available on the webpage of this event. And the link is also shared on the chat for who is with us online. Throughout the event, those who are online can raise their questions by using the Q&A box. We will use your questions to feed the discussion after the presentations. Of course, who is in the room will be able to engage personally with the panel. With that, Pascal, over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and to the entire Geneva Environment Network team for making it possible to have this event. I'm extremely pleased here to welcome you on behalf of UNEP, on the United Nations Environment Programme office here in Geneva, to this launch of this report, where we've been working extensively to bring these recommendations to the attentions of governments at first, but also to many other stakeholders like the industry itself, the civil society, and the users of sand. So you might think, why are we talking about sand? And in fact, it seems so common, you know. But how much sand do you think you've been using today? And it's about a bit more than 17 kilograms per day for everybody on planet Earth. So that's the amount of sand we're using. And if you don't believe it, just look around you. And you've been walking on the sidewalks, you've been driving on the streets, the wall of this building, the floor, the windows, all of that is made of sand. The computers you're looking at the moment, the memory chips is made of sand. So we are totally dependent of this material, yet it is really an unrecognized hero for development. So we've been working here at GRID-Geneva since 2014 on this issue of sand and sustainability. I've got my team here with me. So we have Josephine, Raymond, Lingard with us. We have the GRID-Geneva team also with Stephanie Schua, with Arno van der Welpen and Yanis Giggers, and myself been working extensively with many of the authors that are, some of them are with us today. So also want to welcome here, we have Astrid Smits from the Bureau Brussels. We have Daniel Frank online, who will be one of our panelists. We have Alinishi Yusuf from Kenya, also will be part of the panelists. We have the pleasure to have Elena van der Vecht here from Deltares, as well as Louise Gallagher is here in the room. We have, unfortunately, Mark Guacho, who was on the panel, could not make it because of COVID situation, but I've got the pleasure to have on my left Kiran Pereira from Sand Stories, who also will be a panelist. We have Vera van der Lerken and here, and many others, Mark as well, Russell. So we are very pleased here to welcome you to present the result of this report. It's been a very nice endeavor to bring this knowledge and recommendations to that. So I will start with a small introduction on the subject, and before we hand over to some colleagues for further opening. So I was starting with why we're talking about sand. And the question of sand is something that has really been undercover, because most people, when they think about sand, that's what they think about. They think about the beach. But and as nice as it is, the most of the stuff that we're doing with sand is actually not lying on the beach. What we're doing is we are building roads, many kilometers of road every year. We are also making our house and buildings and health facilities and schools and other buildings. We are also building dams for hydropower. We are using sand for glass, for windows and bottles and all things made of glass. And we are even, as I was saying, using them in computer chips. So we are really depending on sand. Our society is literally built on sand. And we are also using sand for land reclamation, so taking some territory on the sea. So altogether, all this sand is being produced very slowly through erosion process. So it's done at a geological time. To go from a rock into a grain of sand, it takes thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And we humans are using sand in a very fast way. We are using 50 billion tons of sand and gravel per year. So 50 billion tons is such a big number that I try to find what it could represent. So it's a wall of 27 meter high, 27 meter wide, all around planet Earth every single year. That's the amount we're using. So sand and gravels are the biggest solid material that we are using, we human. And of course, you cannot withdraw 50 billion tons out of the environment without leading to generate impact on the environment, as well as generating societal impacts. So we have to differentiate two cases. When you take sand from a static environment, by static I mean where the sand and gravels are not directly interacting with the ecosystem. So we're talking here about quarries like this one, where you dig a hole. It has an impact on the environment in terms of landscape, and you remove the vegetation. But after 50, 60 years of operation, you can use that hole to get rid of some inert material and then recover by earth and back to agricultural land or forest. So if it's properly made, actually, as ugly as it may look here, it can be done properly. Now, you can also use by smashing and crunching rocks. So from mountains, you can smash them and make sand and gravel. So that's another way. And again, it has a visual impact, but it's not as bad as when you take it from a dynamic environment. And by dynamic environment, I mean the beach, a river, or the marine environment. If you're taking sand from the beach, like we see on the top left corner, imagine the beach just after 1 day of this operation. It's just gone. And the beach is a very dynamic area where it's the interface between the sea and the land. So it's protection against coastal erosion. It protects us from infiltrations of salty water into coastal aquifers. It's the home of turtles, crabs, birds. It's a very important ecosystem. And of course, it is the possibility to have tourist development. Now, if you remove the beach, obviously you're losing all of that. Now, in rivers, if you're taking sand from rivers, you're changing the river flows. It means that the rivers can go faster or slower. It might have impact on floods and droughts. It can lower the aquifer. It can have impacts on the river bench that can get eroded. It changes the turbidity of the water with impact on the fishes, again, on livelihood of some people. If you take the sand from the marine environment, and if you look at this boat at the bottom right, it looks like a giant vacuum cleaner, and it's exactly what it does. It means that by taking the sand from the bottom of the sea, you are sterilizing this area by crunching all the microorganisms and by removing the material from the bottom that is the home, the habitat of the microorganisms that are feeding the small fishes that in turn are feeding the bigger fishes. So you have a high impact on biodiversity and on fisheries. And usually those boats are rejecting the small particles that are not of commercial value, and that is creating a kind of a plume behind them that change the water turbidity. So you have, depending where, you have quite a lot of impacts. Now, to address those impacts, in 2014, I wrote a report initially to name those impacts, and then we wanted to look at solutions. So we gathered in this room, actually, an expert roundtable in 2019, and we get the expert solutions that we published in the first report in 2019. That report was circulated in the United Nations Environmental Assembly, and we'll see it led to a resolution. Now we are launching this second sand and sustainability report, 10 strategic recommendations to avert a crisis, because we really believe that it's still early on, that if we are acting now, we can avoid to get into a crisis and for once try to prevent that we get into a dangerous area instead of just reacting to it. So that is what we are launching today. The impact we already had in the past, if we look at the international policy, in 2019, we got this first resolution on mineral resource governance that was adopted by all member states at the United Nations Environment Assembly. In 2020, there was a call from an urgent call for management of marine and coastal sand adopted by the member states at the IUCN and World Conservation Congress. And very recently, in the 5th United Nations Environmental Assembly in Nairobi in March. There was a new resolution, number 12, on metal and minerals that also request governments and the executive director of UNEP to continue the research on best practices, standards, and to minimize the impact that is associated with the extraction of sand. So we're getting a firmer grip in the political agenda. There is increasing recognition that we need to deal with this issue of sand and gravels. The report is organized, we have 10 recommendations. They are organized this way. So recommendation 1, 2, and 3 are setting the overarching agenda. Then we have resolution 4 and 5, that is about setting the right institutional and legal structure. And then we have the resolution 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and it's about how we're going to implement those recommendations, so more like technical recommendations. And we will, Stephanie and Josephine will go through all this resolution to give you a flavor of what we are actually recommending through this report. Just because there's so many, those actually recommendations are quite a lot, but not every recommendation is addressing the same stakeholder. So we have different, we're talking actually to 6 different stakeholders, be the government, the civil society, the financial institutions, especially when you work for development agencies, when they are planning an infrastructure, we have to make sure that they are not, by improving the development on one side, harming the rest of the, for example, water supply or food supply by taking sand for building that infrastructure. So it's very important that we also talk to those financial organizations. We're talking to the extractive industry and to the building industry, as well to the civil society. And to make sure that people can read that easily, we have actually placed those icons on top of all the actions and key actions. So you know if this action is for you. If it's not for you, of course, you're welcome to read it, but at least you can skim through if you are in a hurry and go to what is really meant for your own sector. We did the same for SDGs. The SDGs the sand is related to nearly all SDGs. I don't know why I still have SGS, but never mind, it was meant to be SDGs. All these icons, you know, when it is linked to that specific chapter is talking to the specific SDG, and so you know where it's related to. And that's, we actually talking about addressing about 15 SDGs. And talking about those numbers, so it's 10 recommendations, 43 actions, 22 lead authors, 25 reviewers from all over the place in the regions, 3 international mandates, 15 SDGs out of 17 case studies, many experts interviewed and through the expert roundtable, and 6 targeted audiences, more than 230 references. So quite a lot of work, but the big number is still there, 50 billion tons of sand per year. So that's what we're talking about. Okay, so I wonder if we have, just wanted to have maybe some, Laura? So I just want to hand over to Laura Plaskov, who's from the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, who supported financially the production of this report and has been also giving lots of policy guidance, and the Swiss government has been really instrumental in bringing this since the 2019 report. So thank you for your support, and just a little word of introduction from Laura. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening to everybody listening. I'm very pleased to provide a few remarks on the broader context of the launch of this new report on sand and sustainability. I think this report brings much knowledge on the topic and really can inspire the forthcoming discussions on what concrete actions government, industries, end users, and other stakeholders can take to manage sand more sustainably. And as Pascal mentioned, many of us do not realize the importance of sand in our daily lives. Every day we consume 18 kilos. That's really a very big number. And the extraction of sand has really increased a lot over the last decades, by a factor of 5 over the last 50 years. So it's really an important topic, especially since this trend of demand will continue to grow, given massive infrastructure needs in the coming years. So it's really striking to see that sand and gravel account for the largest volume of solid material extracted globally, but still is perceived in many regards as insignificant and unlimited. So this report really demonstrates that this is problematic for many reasons, because of the importance of sand, but because also, as was explained very clearly by Pascal, the extraction can have really major environmental impacts on rivers, coastal and marine ecosystems, among others. So this report really shows as well that the alerts about the fact that the long-term availability of sand should not be taken for granted as such. So it's, however, despite this difficult context, it's encouraging to see the strong political momentum and the worldwide awareness around the necessity to tackle these challenges, thanks to UNEP GRID really instrumental work since its first report on this issue, which was released in 2014. And it's really good to see that since 2019, no less than 4 resolutions were adopted by the United Nations Environmental Assembly, which is the world's highest political decision-making body for the environment. And these 4 resolutions call for a more sustainable management of sand or mineral resources more generally, and also for a better use of sand in infrastructure. And the resolution also recognized really this important work of UNEP GRID Geneva as really a global center of expertise on this topic. In particular, the resolution on environmental aspects of minerals management, which was adopted early March a few weeks ago, specifically requests UNEP through UNEP GRID-Geneva to strengthen this policy knowledge on sand, to really support global policies and action for the environmentally sound management of sand. So the resolution also requests UNEP to conduct an intergovernmental process of consultations where member states will be requested to develop proposals to enhance the environmental sustainability of minerals. And this proposal will be considered at the next UNEA in 2024, sorry. So this report with the 10 recommendations and the list of possible actions that are identified can really inform this intergovernmental process and the elaboration of those proposals, but also can inform the wider stakeholders exchanges. So I really look forward to today's and future discussions on this topic with the help of this report. So thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for this insightful word of introduction. So this room is actually quite important for the sand. I'm telling you why. In October 2018, this is where we held in that specific room the first expert roundtable on sand. Then this is in March 2019 that the launch of the 2019 report was done by the executive director of UNEP from that room again. Again, in October 2021, we held here the second round of expert roundtable in this room, and now we are launching it from this room. So I think, maybe this is where the whole thing starts, and maybe if one day we get to a convention on use of sand, there might be a commemorate plates on that room. You never know. Anyway, that's without further ado, we will go through those 10 recommendations, and I'm turning now to Josephine Lingard Raymond, because she's been really following this issue from the heart of the GRID-Geneva team of sand and also of the lead authors. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Pascal. Well, hopefully this will be a room for commemoration about sand. And as you will see on the slides, these 10 recommendations, they aim to be cross-sectoral and cross-border in the solutions that they put forward. And first and foremost, that requires recognizing sand's strategic value, and this requires formalizing and evaluating its role that it provides for human life, ecosystem services, maintaining biodiversity, and many other functions that Pascal has been mentioning throughout the report, as we have, but also in his presentation. And that requires, as you will see on the next slide, anticipating the demand that will come with growing sand demand. As you can see here, from population growth, from migration from rural to urban areas, but also catching up on development. And this is not just specific to one area, but an issue that we will see emerging across the world and is not specific to one geography. In hand with recognizing its value within our existing systems, it goes in hand with recognizing, on the next slide, please. Thank you. It requires setting an overarching agenda that includes place-based perspectives for just and sand transition. And that includes ensuring the voice of all the impacted people by policy actions that are required are included in the dialogues and the negotiations around these solutions and their implementation. This requires including their voices in any discussions, accompanying workers' rights in a transition, and ensuring that the governance of any solution is done at the same scale as the issue. In hand with including a place-based approach to any solution, it goes in hand with setting a paradigm shift, because these types of solutions, and that we're discussing throughout this report, they require systemic shifts in how we operate our economies, organizational structures, and that will take time. But many solutions are already out there being tested. There's many opportunities and positive sides to this that we already see, but that will require addressing barriers that we see out there. And many of these barriers can be addressed through promoting public-private knowledge networks, aligning fiscal policies, encouraging capacity building within some of the key sectors that we're discussing, including construction, mining, architecture. And these hints to the many stakeholders that we need to bring to this table for these solutions to be implemented in the long term. In mentioning these types of shifts that we need to see happen, this will require a system that works to support these changes. So adopting strategic and integrated policy and legal frameworks that facilitate these goes in hand in how we govern this resource. So one option here, that we're putting forward in this report, is aligning these policy and legal frameworks that work on the ground. As you will see in this report, the situation is very different, whether you're discussing Asia, Africa, South America, the European continent. The situation is different every time. And that means that any solution needs to be fitted to the local context, development imperatives, and resource availability that goes with it. That's why an approach like policy integration could work here hand in hand with this. And that works when policy problems need to be understood, common visions need to be set, and working along with stakeholders across the sand value chain. And really ensuring that policy actions, they're compatible, but they also align between different stakeholders. And likewise, in moving towards this type of just, sustainable sourcing, extraction, but also use and transport of sand that we discussed throughout this report, that requires establishing ownership, but also access to these resources through a mineral rights and a consenting framework that really regulates how this resource is being extracted, sourced, but also sold, as in many places. And that goes here in hand with creating a legal framework that works through a locally accepted commercial mechanism for cost recovery. Over to you, Stephanie.
So the next 5 recommendations, so we're looking at recommendations 6 to 10, they are at the implementation level, and these are instruments that would be needed to manage sand as a resource. So moving on to recommendation 6, calling for more mapping, monitoring, and reporting on sand resources for transparent, science-based, and data-driven decision-making. And that would mean to invest in strategic resource mapping, accounting, monitoring along the production, consumption chain to include extraction, use, transport, and end-of-life to be able to ensure long-term supply. And of course, to have more research to mitigate environmental impacts. So looking at recommendation 7, to establish best practices, national standards, and a coherent international network. We know that, and this is for extraction of primary resources and for technical standards for materials and building infrastructure. So we know that these standards and best practices, they exist on how to minimize impact when we extract. However, there's a need to share it and to test it at a multilateral level, and of course for them to be updated in some cases. So that would also mean the need for an international framework for these standards and guidelines. So if we move on to the next recommendation, looking at recommendation 8, to promote resource efficiency and circularity. So for the sand supply chain, circularity would mean to reduce net demand of sand, to replace sand, the use of naturally occurring sand, and to reuse sand or sand-containing products, and finally to recycle when reusing is not possible. And that would mean to promote policies and to provide cost incentives to mainstream, test, and support these alternatives. So moving to recommendation 9, responsible sourcing. That is for us to push for the adoption of a responsible sourcing framework and to implement the principle of supply chain accountability. So this means to engage with the multiple players in infrastructure projects, from funders to extractors, and to ensure that accountability is managed at the highest level possible. So last but not least, moving to recommendation 10, to restore ecosystems and compensate remaining losses. And that means to minimize impact of sand mining projects on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And that means to adopt nature-based solutions and compensation mechanism to restore degraded ecosystems. So that's our 10 recommendations. Over to you, Pascal.
Thank you, Stephanie. And so in the panel now, we have the pleasure to have many of the lead authors along with us in the panel. So let me introduce you first. We start by the furthest away. So Daniel Franks is Professor Daniel Franks is Deputy Director of the University of Queensland Sustainable Mineral Institute. He works with UNEP to implement the UN Environment Assembly's Mineral Resource Governance Resolution, and he is the originator of the concept of development minerals and recently co-authored a report on the ore sand as a solution to the global sustainability crisis of sand and mine tailings. We also have, so very welcome, Professor Franks. We have with us also Professor Vera van Lingard, is a marine geologist of the Royal Belgium at the Institute of Natural Sciences and a professor at Ghent University. Vera is one of Europe's leading experts on marine sand extraction impacts and is known for her assessment in the Belgian-Dutch marine sand reserves. We have with us Dr. Elena van der Vecht, is an advisor on coastal morphodynamics at Deltares. Elena is an expert in sedimentology and computational modeling in coastal and river delta environments. We have Alinishi Yusuf, is the managing director of the Makueni County Sand Conservation and Utilization Authority, an agency of the county government at Makueni in Kenya, and is in charge of sand matters in the county. Very welcome, Alinishi from Kenya. And next to me, we have Kiran Pereira, is the author of the book Sand Stories, Surprising Truths About the Global Sand Crisis and the Quest for Sustainable Solutions. And she's the founder of sandstories.org. She works at as a social entrepreneur to find and promote solutions for the global sand crisis. So we have distinguished experts with me here on for this panel. So we'll start with Daniel Franks. So Daniel, so how do we ensure that people working in informal settings still have livelihood? Because we got to shift all these things. So how are we going to make sure that we don't, that people are not falling across the cracks here?
Well, thanks for the question, Pascal. It was great to be part of the author team, and hello to everyone who's joining in person and online around the world. This is a huge issue. Millions of people mine sand in thousands of places. And if we're to make that shift away from the unsustainable settings, it's going to imply a huge transformation that could affect a really large number of people. Sand is predominantly locally mined, and a significant proportion of sand mining is by artisanal and small-scale miners, and they're mining as a livelihood strategy in circumstances of poverty. In the report, we wrote about what just sand transitions might look like. And we highlight the importance of involving all interested and affected people in sand governance and decision-making, especially the workforce that could be impacted by reform. And the reason why it's important is because being informal is not the same as being unsustainable. And there must be accessible pathways for formalization of sand mining, accompanied by well-designed environmental and social obligations. really the only way to make a successful environmental transition is to create a successful social transition through better practices or through alternate livelihoods and opportunities.
Well, that's Professor Frank. So I remember every time that we got an interview from journalists, they always come with the same thing, like illegal sand mining, sand mafia. It seems like it's all about sand mafia and illegal sand mining, but we know its truth is probably different. So you've been very critical about the use of terms like sand mafia and the description of sand miners as criminals. Can you tell us why, and could it not be said that it is necessary to crack down on illegal extractions?
So my experience of this is coming from spending a lot of time with sand miners in many countries, and realizing the circumstances in which that mining takes place. So I think inclusivity is really important in the language that we use. And like you said, too much of the media and debate only references sand miners as criminals or uses terms like sand mafia, right? And there are huge barriers to artisanal small-scale miners to obtain legal licenses in some countries, and sand is excluded from the formal definition of minerals in the Mining Act in those countries, often leaving kind of no opportunity to really mine legally. So the loose term, my problem is with the loose term of the loose use of the term sand mafia, because it implies that the informal sand miners are in positions of power, which is actually not the situation in many places. Now, it's not to say that there aren't sand mining actors that, will resist change or that extract without concern for the environmental social consequences or have used power, corruption, or even violence to entrench the status quo. But generalizing examples where sand mining is linked with criminal activities to be the global situation actually won't be very productive. We need to mobilize large numbers of people in practice change, many of whom are coming at it from a situation of poverty. And we're only going to be able to do that if we bring people along in the process and if that change results in improvements in livelihoods.
Well, thank you very much. And find, of course, more details on the resolution 2 of that report. And thank you for staying up that late, because I know it's like 11:30 in Brisbane. So thank you really much for being present with us.
Thanks,
I now
everyone.
turn to Vera van Lanker, Professor Lanker van Lanker. Are we running out of sand? I mean, it's like that's a question that comes very often as well. And what can be done to monitor and report on sand extraction?
Yes, thank you. And also thank you for being part of this exciting group and the work we have been able to do. So clearly from a geological occurrence perspective, of course, there is an abundance of sand and there would be no issue. However, if you start looking at the quality and quantities, it's a different story. But the simple answer would be, we actually don't know. And there are only few places where actually the reserves have been mapped. So there are still a lot of areas globally that are unmapped. And there are only few places where actually models exist of how many sand you have, and then also critically what the quality of that sand is, which is very important from an industrial perspective. And then thirdly, of course, it's clear that with growing environmental regulation, with growing human activities, both land and at sea, also with growing needs for protection of cultural heritage, that the actual accessibility to the sand resource is also is decreasing quite a lot as well. So if you look then at the actual reserve that you can exploit, and if you want to have a high confidence in what is actually occurring there in terms of quality and quantity, we are really talking about quite a decrease. And in some regions, there is indeed already a shortage, especially in the high quality sands. So what we need to do is indeed speed up the process of mapping and starting especially with the areas where no data exist, but still, and there are some ways to accommodate for that. And then really to join up and to go for structural collaborations, but also geological surveys can play a big role in joint forces, sharing knowledge, capacity building, and training. So there is a huge way to go, but clearly with partnerships, we can reach a lot.
Scary, isn't it, that to say we don't know with all the science we have, and it sounds like the first solid material we have, and we don't even know where we stand. And I think that's a very, I take that word, because that we should not take supply for granted, and not knowing really call for having a monitoring system in place. So you are the leading expert on the impact of marine geology. Can you tell us what has been done on marine sand extraction, and well, should it be banned?
Well, clearly, the need is ever increasing, and especially from the marine side, there are increasingly offshore developments. There are increasingly visions on how to exploit and go for blue growth initiatives. And all the basis is they all need sand, but the sand demand is seldom spoken out. And actually, we don't know what is needed. We just know that the whole fundament is based on sand. So, so clearly, regulation needs to be in place. Unfortunately, in many places, the regulation is there. But apart from the regulation, you also need monitoring and reporting. And it's only by monitoring, by actually following up what is happening because of different extraction regime, that we can learn and that we can also share best practices. So also here, there is a need for more cooperation between experts in the field, between the practitioners, between industry, on how we can do better and minimize the impacts on the environment. So clearly there is a need for appropriate assessments, and this is where we should be further investing in and go for a standard on best practice. How can we really look at different criteria, set up decision support systems, and help us on how to safeguard the environment and go for secure and safe supply of sand.
Thank you very much. So be more clever and more thoughtful about how we take and extract things, especially from those dynamic settings. Now turn to Dr. Elena van der Vecht. Elena, how can we extract sand and minimize the impact? I mean, and is there a need for compensation if we do have those impacts?
Thanks for the question, Pascal, and the opportunity to work with this very inspiring group of authors on the report. Actually, in recommendation 10 in the report, we present a framework for helping decision makers to balance the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services with the need for development for society and economy. And it consists of 4 steps: avoid, minimize, restore, and compensate. And what this means is, when we start a sand extraction process, we first ask, can we avoid extracting the sand? The part that we can't avoid, we say, well, can we minimize the amount we extract? If there's part of the sand we don't need to extract, let's leave that in place. For the bit that we still need to extract, we say, well, let's restore the ecosystem services and the biodiversity in the areas we've extracted from. And lastly, where this is not possible, then we compensate. Perhaps we bring biodiversity or the same ecosystem services back in a different location. And so if we take all of these 4 steps, avoid, minimize, restore, and compensate together, we can not only compensate and restore the ecosystem, but in many cases it's possible to even improve biodiversity. And we see this in a number of onshore, on land sand extraction projects in the past as well. We see an increase in biodiversity afterwards where restoration has taken place.
That's really fantastic news, actually. We can improve things. The report is also targeting government and other stakeholders. Could you please tell our public what can they do?
Yeah, so in addition to the policy points that I'm sure my colleagues or co-authors will also make, I think there's a responsibility towards knowledge development and knowledge sharing when it comes to sand extraction. For example, the Dutch government, through the National Science Agenda, has recently funded a large project which will look at sustainable sand extraction from the North Sea. But these kind of large projects, they're not necessarily practical everywhere in the world. So what we require, I think, is that when people run into challenges, that they share those challenges, they discuss it with us, because we are interested in knowing what your local challenges are. I think all the authors of this report are really passionate about the themes that it addresses, and only by collaborating, working together and speaking to each other can we start to solve these problems. And there's a lot of sort of nature-based solution type things out there that we can implement, but we need to get the conversation going.
Thank you very much. And well, is there something the supply chain can do?
Yes, I think that comes back to responsible sourcing. And then the first thing we think about is limiting the social and environmental impact at the source. But there's actually more to it. There's also responsible production, so what the things we make with sand, and responsible end of life. What will happen to all of these things that we're making? And there really, there's a lot of stakeholders, and all of them play a role in this responsible sourcing sort of train, I guess, supply chain. Then for companies, of course, we want to encourage them to join the the UN Global Compact, sorry, which encourages sustainable ways of going about your business. But also here, planning is really important. So we need guidance from governments. We need some planning of what sand will be needed when. Because if we, at the last minute, start to need to extract sand, then it's much more difficult to do it in a sustainable way. If we know what's coming up, if we know in advance, then it's much easier to do this in a sustainable way.
So that's for anticipation. So thank you, Dr. van der Weg. So now we will change continent. We'll go to see Alinishi Yusuf from Kenya. So Alinishi, you have an amazing experience in Makueni County, and actually really positive experience that I was really impressed by the success that you've been achieving in your county. So can you tell us more about your experience in the Makueni County?
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be part of this process and this landmark event for the report launch. And I would say for Makueni County, we started by recognizing that there's a problem due to many years of unregulated and excessive sand harvesting from the riverbeds. And so what Makueni County did was to go for regulation. We have many recommendations, and so the easiest to pick was to begin by regulating sand harvesting, because the county government recognized that consumption of sand is going to be there until we have alternatives. And so one of the entry points as a government was to regulate how it's being harvested, where it's being harvested, and also look at environmental protection. And so Makueni County government first did a total ban on sand harvesting for export outside the county. In 2015, and came up with a legislation which was passed by the Assembly of Makueni in 2015, that has created a special entity, the Sand Authority, where I work, and it's dedicated exclusively to supervising sand matters within the county, and also promoting sand conservation, but also regulating and also providing for sustainable utilization. And most importantly, also providing for equitable sharing of the benefits that accrue from the sale of sand. And so since 2015, Makueni County has been regulating the sand that is being consumed within Makueni County, has maintained a ban on export on sand, and this has reduced the pressure on our sand resources within the rivers, because the sand harvesting that has been done in Makueni over the decades has been done from the dry riverbeds. Makueni is an arsal county, and so most of the rivers are actually ephemeral rivers that flow for a short period after the rain season and then remain dry for the rest of the year. And so these are the same rivers that would be descended upon by huge trucks to ferry sand, and this led to huge environmental degradation, lowering of water levels in the rivers. It was associated with many social issues, such as violent conflict that led to deaths. It also came with other social issues like school dropout rates were high, because it's a very easy entry point for people without capital to invest. You only need a spade and you're good to go. And so it attracted young people. And so we recorded a huge drop in school-going kids and associated early pregnancies with the young girls. And so it was a myriad of problems. And since 2015, due to the regulation, this has been controlled. There's less pressure on the rivers because we're only harvesting what is being consumed within Makueni County. There's a body that is regulating sand harvesting, and it is working in collaboration with the community, because within the Act, there's a strong component on community participation. in co-management. And so through this, social vices such as infiltration of young children into the mining sector has been dealt with. We do not have violent cases, conflicts. Since 2016, actually, Makueni County has not had a single violent conflict due to access and control over sand. It is also through this process that we've been able to collect revenue in the process of regulation. And this is revenue that the county government, through the Sand Authority, has been plowing back into conservation efforts, because 50% of the proceeds from the concessions that have been done on sand harvesting within Makueni County go back into conservation. We have been building sand dams, and sand dams help the rivers by impounding sand, and really we aid the river to restoration. And so it's a mix of reducing through regulation, but also helping the ecosystem, the river ecosystem to rejuvenate by aiding it through construction of sand dams. And so I would say recognition that there's need for regulation was what Makueni County picked and ran with it. As we also look at other issues that other players can actually come in to help in addressing, like research on alternatives, looking at recycling, reusing, upscaling, and such things. And so as a government, there was need to stamp authority, but also work with the community and start averting the problem. And we have recorded tremendous progress since 2015. The rivers are coming back to life. We have more sand deposits, and this means we have more water that is being stored in the rivers. So communities are able to access water for a longer period during the dry season from shallow wells. Boreholes, wells have more water for a longer period. They have more yield because the underground water storage has been rejuvenated by, through this process. And so I would say it's been a successful journey through regulation, but I wouldn't say we're completely out of the woods. We still have to entrench governance, especially because our neighboring counties are not doing anything on sand regulation. And so the outcomes within Makueni County can only go so far because our neighbors are not doing anything.
Thank you, Alinishi. And this is absolutely incredible, because we knew, of course, about the impact of sand on rivers and how it could affect the water supply. But from that story, we learned that it could also lead to social impacts, such as teenagers dropping out of school and early pregnancy. So who would have thought that extraction of sand could lead to such a wide array of impact? But Makueni County is, to my understanding, is the only county in Kenya that is regulating sand mining. So can you do that in isolation, or how can it be done to make progress and locally and more perhaps nationally? Any ideas?
It's actually been a big challenge for Makueni County, being smack in the middle of other sand mining counties that have not in any way regulated sand harvesting. And so monitoring and also enforcing the law has been a bit of a challenge, because we share administrative borders. And so I foresee a challenge here, and one of the things that can be done to address is to probably have a regional approach towards sand governance, so that we have a homogeneous way of addressing issues. At a national level, there could be a national framework that can be put in place to address sand issues across the country, and this will help in coordinating all the subnational governments that have sand deposits and would like to continue exploiting the resource, but in a sustainable way. And so it's important to start having a regional approach. We cannot continue working in isolation, because the rivers we're talking about are, span through, the river basin that we're talking about span through and go across the territorial borders. And so that means that the results that we are aiming at as a county can only be achieved if all of us actually start working together. Something else that also needs to be done is invest a lot in education, public awareness, what we're doing now, creating campaigns to raise awareness. It's unfortunate that sand issues, even now, are still not very well understood by a lot of people at all levels, from the ignorant to the very well educated. And this is one of the reasons that probably some governments and other stakeholders may not have recognized the need to start changing the conversation and having a paradigm shift on how we deal with sand issues. And so we must have a robust campaign on educating the masses on sand and sand sustainability and the effects of unregulated sand harvesting. And also invest really in research to look for alternatives, because like the previous, from the report and the previous speakers, we have to apply a mix of approaches to dealing with sand. It's one of the big, I mean, we say it's the most consumed solid resource. And so we may not use one means to deal with the issue. So it has to be a mix, and this requires research. Also tied to research, we all recognize that there's hardly any information out there on sand and sand mining and the quantities and all that, including the evidence that we need to even justify that even regulating sand harvesting can actually be one of the solutions that we're looking at. So we need to invest in research, and so that also the campaigns that we're doing are backed by scientific, research, and this also will help in pushing the momentum on setting the agenda for sand.
Thank you very much, and again, congratulations for all that has been achieved in this in your Maconi county. So this is really setting the example for further action from other countries. I'm now turning to my left to Kiran Pereira. So we need to change. No, it's not about the same for sustainable development. Actually, we cannot continue the way we've been doing, and with 50 billion tons per year, it's not about just slightly changing, it's about revolutionizing the way we operate. So what are the various options we have to reduce sand extraction, and can we completely rethink our relationship to sand?
I'd say yes. So thank you again for having me here, and again, I echo all the other authors. It's a privilege to be here. I thank you. In answer to your question, definitely, yes. I would say a resounding yes, yes, yes. One of the people I interviewed for my book said something that really caught my attention. He said, the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones. So it made me sit up and take notice and think about it. I think I take inspiration from author and activist Rob Hopkins, who talks about moving from what is to what if. What if we decide to build infrastructure with a different palette of materials, with increasing, vernacular architecture can be a super win-win solution. So there can be materials like, there can be timber, there can be straw bale, there can be hemp, there can be cob, rammed earth. I mean, we live in the Anthropocene. We have so much waste material that can be repurposed. And there are fantastic research projects already showcasing how this is possible. So I think building on this kind of work is what is required.
That sounds excellent. It gives lots of hope, because indeed that there are many options here. But if it's not done, so what are the main barriers for that?
That's a $1 million question. I think we need to consider systemic barriers, because although solutions exist, what's really blocking progress is systemic barriers. Misaligned policies can kind of lock in the status quo. You don't have sufficient insurance for regenerative renewable materials, so that kind of blocks those kind of solutions. Sometimes you have policies which incentivize demolition. It's cheaper to pull down a building and build afresh than it is to maintain and retrofit and preserve a building and the embodied value and the embodied carbon in that particular building. So these kind of policy shifts are really, really urgently required. These are the kind of shifts that will help the climate, that will help biodiversity, that will help the pollution, the kind of overarching problems of our time. I think we also need to be aware of the embedded biases within systems, because colonial powers imposed building codes on many places, right? And so I heard Sumita Singh from Ecologic Architects talk about how in India, for example, vernacular architecture got classed as kacha, which means weak and impermanent and not something to be aspired to. Whereas concrete and steel architecture got classified as pakka, which is strong and powerful. And so these 200 years of colonial rule have had some effect. So we need to be cognizant of the kind of biases embedded within systems.
Thank you, Kiran. We all love stories, and you wrote this book, Sand Stories. So can you share some examples of projects that support regenerative and circular future from your book and research?
Absolutely. I think, so there are several projects that I found really inspiring. Projects that use straw, for example, straw bale and timber. This is not in my book, but I think I'd like to talk about the larger perspective. There's a project called Lilac, which is a low-impact living, affordable community in the UK, built out of straw bale and timber. And it's based in Bramley and Leeds. If every home in the UK were built like that particular building project, we would say there would be a 42% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's huge. The UK could save more than 666,000 Olympic swimming pools of water. So it's massive. The kind of potential there is really, really massive. I think you see really exciting examples of countries trying to upcycle materials, which are currently part of waste streams. They could be used as resources and repurposed to build construction material. It's exciting to see circularity being brought in various ways. So sustainability does not begin, it begins at the design stage. You think about the end of life at the start, right? You think about what's going to happen when needs for this building changes. Is that material, where's it going to go? We think about stuff like that. So building material passports, reversible building designs, these are, trying out new models where you can offer, instead of offering products, you can offer them as processes. There are tremendous examples there. So it's really, really possible.
Well, thank you, Kiran, and thank you to all our panelists. And of course, you find more on this report that is now from today available, and you get all the stories in and more stories in Kiran's book. And please get to these things, because it's a fascinating subject, and it's not a new. Basically, it's new to many people, but it's not new. It's part of this change that we need to do for aiming at sustainable development. You cannot fish more fishes than they reproduce themselves. You cannot cut more trees than they grow. You cannot take more sand than it's renewable. After one, you will get to the limit. So we still have this idea that Earth is infinite and the resources just so abundant. But we are so numerous, and we are increasing our demand for natural resources in such a fast way that if you look at my own life, during my own life, there was the population doubled. And but the GDP, the gross domestic product, was multiplied by 21. So the amount of resources that we are taking from each individual, and those number of individuals being growing, still having a lot of people that do not have the minimum well-being. So we cannot continue like this. Sustainable development is about making use of what we have as disposal without compromising the future of the next generations. And so this story about sand is the same story as anything that we are looking at sustainable development. It's not the other. It's not just another problems on the table. It's part of the entire problem of sustainable development. And we cannot continue and just say, okay, we're going to slightly adapt. For climate change, we need to divide by 2 our emissions in less than 8 years. It's unbelievable. You look around you, people are dreaming. Guys, hey, wake up. This is less than 8 years. We have to divide by 2. We have not so far even being able to decrease our greenhouse gases. We have been decreasing the increase. That's where we've been. So we're a long way to go. But for sand, it's not too late. We can take action now. We can do things. But it's about thinking differently. If we think about, just take an example of mobility. We have more people, they need to go to job, do their groceries, leisure, collect the kids and so on. And for that, we have an increase in mobility. And so far the answer was, oh, more mobility, let's go for more cars. Oh, they're stuck in the traffic, let's build more roads. And it's just this continuous thinking of growth, whereas we have to rethink it. We have to say, oh, okay, more mobility. How about we do trains and subways? And then imagine how many people, even of the single drivers, because most people are single in their car, how many drivers you put in one train, maybe 1,000 of them. And then this train is actually used and reused, whereas an individual car stays 98% of the time totally in the same place, not moving at all. So the resources needed for building those cars and then for moving those cars around, emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, emitting pollution, emitting noises, all these kind of impact that we are imposing ourselves could be solved by building roadways and subway, which would actually need less sand and gravels to be built in the first place. And if you think about subway, if you have the right geology, actually digging tunnels might be a way to create material. So it's the complete opposite. You're actually generating material by digging tunnels. So it's just taking the paradigm upside down, rethinking the way we do development. And at the end, it's not like going backwards. It's not like having less of a quality of life. Instead, subway are way faster for moving from point A to point B rather than being stuck in a traffic jam. You have less greenhouse gases, so also addressing the climate crisis. You have less air pollution. Air pollution is killing, ambient air pollution and outside air pollutions are killing 6 million people per year. You have less noise. So it's a win-win-win kind of things, an option just by rethinking the way we do development. And this is not only for sand and gravels. We have to do that anyway to achieve sustainable development, because if we don't, the world sustainable means to keep on going. And if we have non-sustainable development, it stops. And we cannot stop this way. We have more people coming on the planet, and we still have many people that do not have access to the minimum well-being. So we need a development, but we need a different development. And really, this is what we talk about, this 10 strategic recommendation to avert a crisis. It is still time to do something, but we need to act not only for sand and gravel, for all sustainable development, but that's one key element that it is to be considered. So with this, I open now the floor to questions. So in the room, and you can also use the chat to have the question, and Arno can redirect your question to us. So floor is yours for questions.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you for giving me the floor. We already received quite some questions through the chat, and I will start with a question of Lavenir. This question is to you, Pascal. Are there alternatives available to substitute for sand from the natural environment, and are these sufficient to meet the large demand?
Well, that's really the big question. How are we going to swap from these 50 billion tons taken from the natural environment to other things? So we have in the report several options that we are putting together. One option is to use to recycle the material from the buildings that we are knocking down. So there's several countries have taken some incentive measures by taxing landfill and by subsidizing recycling, so that it becomes a good incentive for reusing this material, and by gently crunching. I mean, that sounds like a kind of a position term, but if you smash and you explode the material, you're creating like 30% of dust, and there's nothing much you can do with it. But if you do it more gently, you can go up close to 100% and recycle this material. So that's one thing, is getting more circularity by recycling the material. The other option, if we're talking about billions of tons, there are many options, but when you look at such a high volume, this is what we've been doing with Professor Daniel Franks and his team and my team. We've been working on a site in Vale in Brazil where they are extracting where they're extracting iron, because the mining industry is the big sector that is generating those large volume of material. And up to now, they were only focusing on the ore they are extracting. In that case, it was iron, and all the rest was leftovers and big tailings. Now, those tailings are just unused material, and we tend to call them mining waste, which looks like really bad, like it looks like heavily polluted material. But we did the analysis, and it was not. It was extremely clean material. It was just very close to sand, but it was left apart because it was not iron anymore. So we looked at the chemical, we looked at the physical grain of this material, and we found out that it could be used for construction if it's blended with coarser material. We also found out that it could be refined to 99.5 to 99.7% of silica sand, so that it can be used directly for making glass. So it's really the kind of thing that we should do. Like, it's not about getting new material from the environment when we have already so many tilings of material that is just waiting for us to be used. And we find out that we looked at globally the demand we looked at the demand worldwide as well as the potential offer from those mining sites, and there are many options for that. So we call that ore sand, so that people don't get confused that this is not mine waste. It's actually, you can extract the ore like iron and extract at the same time as a co-product building material as ore sand. And that is one of the options that I think is the most promising. But there are many others, like Kieran was saying, we can use adobe, we can use timber, we can use bamboo, we can use many other material that was traditionally used before we start to use concrete. So this is also those options that we need to look at.
Okay, then I'll perhaps pass on immediately the next question to Kieran, which is it's along the next line. So from Pascal, we already heard that to an extent mining waste can be recovered, cleaned, that there is also a possibility for co-producing ores and sand. Kieran, are there actually alternatives, perhaps more traditional materials that can compete with, for example, concrete on price?
That's so concrete in many cases can be cheap because the costs are externalized onto societies, onto the environment. Once that is addressed, as the report mentions, once you internalize these costs, you will begin to see a very different picture emerge. And so there are many materials that can compete. And I say this from having spoken to dozens and dozens and dozens of practitioners who face systemic barriers because they don't get insurance. So you cannot build something if you don't get insurance for building projects. So in the UK, we lose 50,000 buildings a year to demolition. Why? Because it's cheaper to just demolish a building. You pay a 5% value-added tax on demolition and rebuilding and new build, but you pay 20% VAT if you want to maintain the building. In a context where we have a climate emergency, this is misaligned policy. It needs to be addressed urgently.
Also encourage people in the room. I saw one question here. Yes, Armel Choplin, Professor Choplin, please.
Yes. Is it okay like this? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this fantastic report. It's an incredible work. So thank you very much. I've got one or two questions linked. It's about the social demand. Pascal, you work on that topic for more than 10 years and maybe 20 years, I don't know. So, and this report is at the moment that we can observe also this social demand is changing. We have seen that with plastic, for example, 5 years ago after the planes. And me, I work on concrete chain and urbanization in Africa. So I also see that, and you have seen that with the Pritzker the prize was awarded to Francis Kéré, okay, one African architect using wood and alternatives, as you mentioned, also vernacular architecture. So did you see, or could you see that now there is this social demand, and this report will accompany this shift and this also very important changing moment? So it's my first question. Have you seen that? And the second one is, what is the next step? I suppose that you will promote this report. There is a lot of advocacy to do, because it's recommendations, and you have published this report in 2019. So is there a new report after? Are you already thinking to that in this room? Could we meet in 3 years to say, okay, it's not only recommendations now, we can also exchange about, I don't know, policies, for example. So I would like to know what are your objectives right now.
Thank you, Professor Joplin. Indeed, social aspects are never too far from environmental impacts. When you have environmental impacts, it affects livelihoods of people. If you affect water supply, people are starting to get mad, and Elinishi can witness that. I mean, people started to set fires to those trucks in Mukane County because they saw that the water was going away, and when water is going away, life is a threat. So you cannot affect other people's livelihood. It's the same in many places where people have been taken sand from mangroves area, and the crabs population was dropping, and then the women who were their livelihood was about collecting crabs and selling them in the market they were losing their livelihood and had to quit the village to get into the cities. And we have many social stuff, very surprising things as well. I mentioned this morning as well, this story in Sri Lanka, where because the rivers were mined by sand, was so much impacted by sand that during high tide, the water came from the sea inside the land. So the rivers were flowing backwards, bringing salty water inland. And not only salty waters, but crocodiles, salty waters were going inland and attacking villages. So you see social impacts, really surprising stories. And of course, all the stories from the Mukone County, from Elinishi, where teenagers are dropping out of schools and early pregnancy and so on. So environmental impacts means social impacts. In north of France, there is a huge appetite from the dredger industry for a very large sand dune, but that sand dune in a marine environment is the home of fishes, and so the fishermen are extremely worried about the sand dune being taken away, because that means that their own livelihood on fishing can be affected. But even not going that far, just in Canton de Vaud nearby, there was recently a contest in the Collines du Mormont, where young people stay there because they didn't want it, that a company was taking the gravels and sand from this area and to destroy this biodiversity and nice landscape. So it is always a tension when you're looking at natural resources in a non-sustainable way. So addressing this environmental impact will also address those societal impact, and we can see now the tension and interest from that. Actually, I've been working on environmental issues since 1992, and I touch upon many different subjects, and many really, a lot of them. But sand somehow it seems like this subject has chosen me. I love that subject though. I'm not complaining, but it seems that there is an emotional context with sand, perhaps because our memories of vacation on the beach. I don't know, there's something emotional about sand. And so people are very surprised about this issue, but they're also really concerned about the way that we're destroying the rivers, we're destroying the coastline, we're destroying the marine ecosystems. And the more people get to know about it, I think the more they will react strongly, like we've seen recently. And some civil unrest as well has been initiated by the sand. So yeah, what are the next steps? I'm not doing report for the sake of doing reports. This report is excellent, don't get me wrong. It's got lots of material information there. We do that to raise awareness. We do that to change the way that people perceive sand, that it's not just a common material. Come on, if our entire development is based on this material force, it must be a strategic resource. So that's really the first thing people have to recognize, that this, once it is recognized, the value would be better understood, and then maybe we'd be wiser. My aim is to create a global sand observatory. We have this as an initiative, but not as a centralized center. We've been working in network with many people now, and just to a small anecdote from the production of this report. last week I was just thanking all the 22 lead authors of this report, saying, great job, now, we're about to launch it. And the authors just say, yeah, okay, what are the next steps? I say, well, guys, you've been working hard. I was already very glad that you were offering your time, and now you want to do more. And yes, we have initiated something here. There is energy, there's a spirit here. The movement is there, and this movement is going to grow. That issue will not go away. It's like climate change or biodiversity loss. There's no way we can get rid of those things. It will, if we don't address them, they will haunt us. There's no way we can get away from these issues. And then, if we don't start now, it will get worse and worse. So we have to do something. And yet not another report. I'm not saying I won't do another one, but it's not the aim in itself. The aim is to change the policies, is to change the way people perceive sand in the governments. They change the laws and regulations, liability on the entire chain supply, that the industry start to extract sand in a better way. So getting higher standards. There are all kind of things to be done. So, but first of all, monitoring to get to know what is there, who's taking what, and for what purpose. What are the options? What are the best practices? What are the standards that we can achieve? And getting a center that can do that, because at the moment, unbelievable. How come the material, the most solid material that we are extracting, there is no one monitoring it? It's like going blind, and we're going against the wall. And we really need to get some visibility here. So getting an organization properly organized to collect this information, and also then to redistribute this information to all that needs those best practices or standards. This is what I have in mind. Not for that. Open funds, guys. I need funds for that.
Thank you, Pascal. I think perhaps I take one question of online, and then I'm going to shift to the lady in the far back who has been waving for quite a while. Vera, I have quite a few questions directed to you, and I'm going just to formulate them in one question, but keep in mind these are actually multiple questions. Are there sustainable ways to use dredge material and more precisely dredging spoil? Is there a way to extract sand from the marine environment in a sustainable way? And should marine sands be reserved for beach nourishment? And then especially looking at small island nations.
Okay, so starting with the first, so the beneficial use of dredge material. So that's indeed something that is already going on for quite some time. So there, it needs to be looked at case by case, because it all depends on the environmental conditions, as well of course on the geological nature and the way or what is dumped and the way it is dumped. So basically, if it would mostly be maintenance dredging, and if it would be disposed of in areas where you have a natural outwash of fine material, then you can expect that indeed what is remaining on the bottom would be like even, let's say, moderate quality sand, but homogeneous enough to be used, some of it maybe even for construction purposes, but definitely for nourishment. If, of course, what is dumped as a combination of maintenance dredging, so just to keep the navigation channels navigable, in combination with capital dredging, so where you really dredge for deeper layers, then in many cases you would also dig up clay material, often hard material, and then it would be a mixture that is dumped. And then you would really have a very heterogeneous building up of your dredge spoils. So typically, after long-term dumping, you have really a topographic high. And then in the neighborhood, you have then also the washout of that dumped material. So I think for the future, it's really interesting also to think, can we change on the dumping strategies? Can we proactively already think ahead that this material would be reused, and also think, okay, how should we dump then? So this is really a new thing to consider. Your second question?
My second question was one of the authors said, yeah, look, not one of the authors, one of the people asking questions said, look, boats seems like quite a sustainable way to go about it. Dredging from the marine environment for sand mining, can it be done in a responsible and sustainable way?
So again, this needs to be looked at in a case by case or environmental condition wise, and also there the geology really matters. So, and that's the starting point, of course. Are you extracting in a sediment-rich environment or in a rather sediment-poor environment? And this, of course, matters a lot. So typically, like on the Belgian shelf, the extraction is already going on for 40 years, and the extraction has mostly been on the sandbanks. So typically, sandbanks would be a more dynamic environment. So these would already be, the species or the biodiversity living on those banks typically are more resilient to stress. So the natural stress is already higher. And also the fishing activities would typically occur in the troughs in between the sandbanks. So as long as you are actually extracting on top of the sandbanks, you can go on until, of course, the geology changes. And that's a bit of the problem that we are facing, that in relatively sediment-poor areas, once you get onto another geological layer, it stops. The quality is not the same anymore, so you would have an issue anyhow for your construction purposes. So it's really the extraction regime, the geology, and the biodiversity that needs to be looked at. But there is indeed a way of managing that, monitoring that carefully, and then you can also think about establishing thresholds of extraction and then together with clear monitoring, you know up to what level you can actually extract in a secure and safe way.
Thank you. The next question, I know you can answer perfectly, but actually, I will still ask it to you. Towards the future, very important. With sea level rise, do we need to reserve sand for beach nourishment?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And where? I mean, is it the sand in the sea that we need to reserve, or what kind of sand? What do we need to look at when we think about beach nourishment, sea defenses?
Well, clearly, from a biodiversity perspective, it's also, of course, the case that the beach nourishment material should be as similar as possible to the original environment or the original beach environment. So ideally, you would go for grain sizes or sediment types that would occur naturally. And then the marine environment offers that best perspective to that. Then it's all, of course, about the volumes and how do you want to nourish? Is it purely on the beach? Are we speaking about foreshore nourishments? Are we speaking about nourishing the fundament, the coastal fundament? But then we are really talking about huge volumes. And then it's really, can you afford that as a member state? And also for nature-based solutions, you typically would need quite big volumes of sand. And you would also already think ahead that you would need to maintain it. So clearly you would have, in the lifetime, you would have losses. So you need to really think carefully on the long term. Do we have enough sand to design this, to build it, and to maintain it? And then, of course, having all of that pressure on the offshore environment is quite a challenge. And so there you need a stepwise strategy. So partly you will always need part of the offshore, but you can also go then for the beneficial use of dredge material. Can you also look at areas where you would have a persistent natural sedimentation of sand, and maybe this can also feed in. And then as a last thing, look for work with work solutions. So a lot of sand is being dredged for harbor construction, for other works, and partly this sand can also be used for case-by-case beach nourishment or maintenance works.
Thank you very much, Vera. A very quick one, because we are running out of time, and I think there were still some questions in the public.
Yes. So a very quick comment on that as well. Regarding the beneficial use of sediments and in particular dredging sediment, I know there's a report coming up by Piank, so to watch out for, which will be on this topic specifically. So if the person asking the question wants to know more about that, that might be a good report to refer to. And secondly, on reserving sand for beach nourishments, I really think that this is which sand is reserved for which purpose is something that needs to be resolved internally by countries, because the one country won't have the same requirements as another one. Low-lying countries need more nourishment, for example.
Thank you. That is very interesting. And I think we can also probably link that to touristic developments where they change like brown beaches for white beaches, that they change the grain size, that we keep in mind has big impacts. Now we go back, the gentleman with the right pencil.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Raymond. I'm an environmentalist based in Geneva. I'm involved with international civil society in the UN Geneva since a long time. I just want to take the floor just to share a comment, and I appreciate all what you raised, and I appreciate also the comment. And as I hear what I hear also about the future and the objectives and the plastic, just about the scaled sand governance. Nowadays, since 2 decades, we recognized how much local governments and cities as a network, as you said, as a network. In UNFCCC in Durban in 2010, there was a document being approved. We recognize cities, how much, because cities, local governments, sometimes without waiting for the green light of the governance, we can take, and for cities also we can think on forest resources. We are focusing on sands, yes, and here nowadays, yeah. And since then, we see, and about sustainability, we raised many analyses about smart cities, sustainable cities. And nowadays, with other UN agencies, many processes are still going on sustainable smart cities. Just to share with you, another networks on sand governance in cities, and there is many opportunities with the governments and the private sectors. Those processes are going on with the other UN agencies. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the public? Otherwise, then I turn to perhaps a final question. Okay, then I'll quickly go back to our online questions. Perhaps an opportunity for Daniel. Daniel, I saw that you made a slight correction on the ore sand. Perhaps you can elaborate very briefly on this, and perhaps also, as it is a topic that often comes up, what conditions lead to informal sand mining? Daniel?
Okay, thanks, Arno. So it wasn't so much a correction, but a clarification that when we're talking about ore sand, we're not talking about repurposing tailings. There have been many efforts to try and repurpose tailings with mixed results. One of the challenges with repurposing tailings is that you have within it some minerals and some elements that aren't suitable to be used in the natural environment, or maybe not suitable for using for a certain construction purpose. What we're talking about is adding mineral processing circuits to extract sand as a byproduct at the same time as you're extracting the metal product. And then you can create, or you can control the conditions that you get the suitable product. On the issue of informality, yeah, this is a huge one. I think there's 3 main reasons why informality persists, particularly in sand mining. The first is there's local demand for an easily accessible resource. Second is poverty. Large numbers of people who are looking for a livelihood. There's personal barriers that they might have to follow formal processes, literacy, lack of financial resources, etc. And third, there's huge regulatory barriers. The process is either absent or it's difficult for artisanal small-scale miners to follow. This is a hugely neglected sector. And so I started working with governments in 2015 while I was working at UNEP to reform sand mining. In many of those countries, their regulatory acts for mining have been set up by colonial governments, and those colonial governments were looking to regulate the minerals needed for the export to the industrial world. So many of those acts do not cover the local minerals and materials that are needed for local development. And that's a huge challenge. When they do exist, they're often too many barriers for artisanal small-scale miners to follow. It might be that you have to go to the capital to make your application, or you might have to do scientific studies to determine what the available resource is. These are things that artisanal small-scale miners find too difficult, and therefore you tend to have largely informal, large numbers of informal people working in sand mining.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Pascal, I give the floor.
Thank you, Arno, and thank you for your insight questions. Really appreciated that. So yes, I started working mostly on climate change, and we know where we are now at climate change. And as a scientist, I was really amazed that we come with lots of evidence, like scientific evidence. It was so good, so clear, and yet there was no actions from the government. So I turned to a professor at university who is looking at emotions and looking at irrational behavior as a psychologist for social science. And I think, what's wrong here? Because obviously we've got lots of evidence and lots of proof. And basically his answer was that our brain was, designed as we were cavemen, and it was designed to react to very immediate danger. Like you're chased by a lion, you run or you attack, you defend yourself, but you react, and your brain is designed for that. And our brain has not really changed. The problem is that the challenges that we are facing now are not the same as our cavemen. So we basically equipped with the brain of a caveman with issues of 21st centuries. And this we need to adapt, because those slow onset situations, climate change, biodiversity losses, pollutions, and the demand of natural resources like sand and gravels are things that are happening gradually but systematically, and it's looming hazards that comes gently but surely, and we are fully equipped to address those kind of things. So this is why we have now a change, not to wait too long for averting this crisis. And those 10 recommendations really need to be taken seriously, because if we apply them now, we can be out of this crisis and not talking about it. If we are not, then we will need to remediate and see how we can mitigate those impacts and live in a poor geological situations with less resources and less options for the future. So this is the reason why we need to address those recommendations. I thank you everybody for attending this meeting. This was a great opportunity for us to launch this report. Important questions that was until recently under the radar screen. Thank you for coming here and physically and online. I would like to thank all the panelists and the participants, and also, of course, the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this. It's always a pleasure to be in an event organized by Jen. And also thank you for the support of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment that supported our research and make it the possibility for us to make it available to everybody. Please read the report, have some more insight, and talk to you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.